The Arizona sun was a merciless hammer, pounding down on the arid landscape. The year was 1883, and the land was a mosaic of dust, sagebrush, and shattered dreams. John Poe Carter, a man whose name was whispered more than spoken, rode his bay mare, Whisper, with the silent stoicism of a tombstone. His past was a ghost that clung to his shadow, a former bounty hunter who had traded a life of violence for one of solitude, not out of piety, but out of a deep, abiding weariness. The journey was meant to be a simple one: get to the town of redemption and sell a few pelts. But the desert had a way of twisting simple things into complex tragedies. The sound of distant gunfire, muffled by the wind, drew his attention. It wasn't the sound of a hunt, but a desperate, one-sided fight. Poe, despite his vow to stay out of trouble, felt an old instinct stir in his gut. He spurred Whisper forward, the rhythm of her hooves a steady drumbeat against the desolate ground. He found the scene a few miles down the trail. A stagecoach, its wheels still spinning slowly in a cloud of dust, lay on its side. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. Bandits, 5 of them, were already picking through the belongings of the deceased. The sight of a man in a fine suit, slumped against a wheel with a gaping hole in his chest, made Poe's stomach turn. This was not a simple robbery. It was a slaughter. He dismounted and moved with the silent grace of a predator. He was a man who knew how to make himself invisible. One of the bandits, a hulking figure with a greasy beard, saw him too late. Poe's Colt Python was out and aimed before the man could even raise his own weapon. The shot was a sharp crack that echoed across the canyon. The other bandits, startled, turned to face him. They saw not just a man, but a reputation. The bounty hunter known as Poe was not to be trifled with. A tense standoff ensued. The lead bandit, a lean man with cold eyes, sneered, "What's this, a new lawman?" "Just passing through," Poe replied, his voice a low rumble. "But I don't much like what you're doing." The bandit laughed, a hollow sound. "Then maybe you'll like this." The gunfight was a blur of motion and noise. Poe moved with a lethal efficiency, a dance of death honed by years of practice. He was faster, more precise. 3 more shots rang out and 3 more men fell. The leader, seeing his crew decimated, threw his hands up in surrender. Poe didn't hesitate. He disarmed the man and tied him up with a strip of leather from his saddle. "You'll be waiting for the law," he said, "if you're lucky." With the threat neutralized, Poe approached the stagecoach. The dead man was a banker. He could tell by the fine clothes and the leather satchel clutched in his stiff hand. But something else caught his eye. A faint whimpering sound coming from inside the overturned coach. He knelt and peered into the shattered window. A young girl, no older than 7, was huddled in the corner, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her eyes, wide and terrified, met his. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She just stared, a silent portrait of shock and trauma. Poe felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a jolt of raw, unadulterated compassion. It was a dangerous feeling in this world. He reached out a hand, but she recoiled. "It's okay," he said, his voice softer than he thought it could be. "I'm not going to hurt you." He carefully pried open the broken door and gently pulled her out. She was so small, so fragile. She clung to him, her small body trembling. The bandit who had surrendered watched, a sneer on his face. "Taking in a stray, are you, cowboy? She's just dead weight." Poe ignored him. He wrapped his coat around the girl, whose name he didn't know, and sat her on his horse. He knew this was a mistake. Taking an orphan, especially one from a prominent stagecoach, would bring him nothing but trouble. The law, her family, the criminals who had attacked the coach, they would all be looking for her. But as he looked into her terrified eyes, he couldn't leave her behind. He couldn't leave a child to die alone in the desert. He mounted his horse behind her, one arm wrapped protectively around her small frame. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of red and gold, a beautiful but deceptive farewell to the day. He looked at the wreckage, the dead bodies, the captured bandit, and knew his life was no longer his own. He was now a guardian, a protector, and the path he had chosen for himself had just been irrevocably altered. He didn't know where he was going or what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something other than emptiness. He turned Whisper around and rode away, leaving the carnage behind, carrying with him a secret that would soon turn his quiet existence into a maelstrom of greed, danger, and an unexpected kind of love. The banker's heiress, though he didn't know it yet, was now his burden and his purpose. The ride to redemption was slow and cautious. Poe kept to the lesser-used trails, avoiding any travelers who might spot them. The girl, still silent, clung to him. He tried to speak to her, but she wouldn't answer. Her silence was a heavy, palpable thing. Her name was all he knew, a name he found on a small embroidered handkerchief in her pocket, Sarah. He reached the outskirts of redemption, just as the last rays of sunlight faded. The town was a collection of dusty wooden buildings, a church steeple, and a saloon that promised a night of drunken revelry. Poe rode down the main street, the sight of a grizzled, solitary cowboy with a small child in his arms, a strange spectacle. Heads turned, whispers followed them like a trail of dust. He dismounted in front of the town's boarding house, run by an old woman with a face as weathered as the desert itself. Mrs. Gable, a woman known for her sharp tongue and a surprisingly kind heart, emerged from the porch. She took one look at Poe and the little girl, and her eyes narrowed. "Poe Carter," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "What's this? Found yourself a little shadow?" "She needs a place to stay," he said, ignoring the veiled accusation. "And food." Mrs. Gable looked at Sarah, who was hiding her face in Poe's coat. A flicker of sympathy softened her gaze. "She looks half-starved. Come on in, both of you." Inside, the boarding house was clean and warm, a welcome respite from the cold desert air. Poe sat Sarah down at a table and ordered a meal for her. He watched as Mrs. Gable brought a bowl of stew, her movements stiff but gentle. Sarah ate slowly, as if she had forgotten how. The news of Poe's strange companion spread through the town like wildfire. By the next morning, the mocking had begun. At the general store, the owner, Mr. Higgins, a plump man with a sneer, looked at Poe and Sarah with undisguised contempt. "Heard you found yourself a stray, Poe," Higgins said, a few other men gathering around to listen. "A bit of a burden, isn't she? A man like you with no one to look after. What's a killer like you doing with a child?" Poe's jaw tightened. "She's an orphan. Her family was attacked by bandits." "An orphan, is she?" A man named Silas scoffed. "More like a meal ticket, I bet. Going to use her for sympathy, are you? A man who makes his living hunting men now wants to play the hero." The words were a physical blow. Poe felt a familiar rage boil up inside him, the same rage he had felt when his own family was taken from him. But he looked at Sarah, her small hand clutching his, and he swallowed the anger. He couldn't afford to fight, not now. He was a guardian. He had a responsibility. "Mind your business, Silas," Poe said, his voice dangerously low, "or I'll make it my business to remind you what a killer can do." The men backed off, but the mockery didn't stop. It followed them down the street, a constant hum of whispers and cruel laughter. "Poe the Protector," someone called out. "Poe the Pappy." Sarah, though she didn't understand the words, understood the tone. She saw the scorn in their eyes, the way they looked at her as if she were a defect. She hid behind Poe's leg, her small body trembling. Later that day, a local sheriff, a tall, gaunt man named Elias, approached Poe. He was a man who had known Poe for years, and he saw the change in him. "Poe, what's going on?" Poe told him the story, leaving out the details of the fight and focusing on the stagecoach and the bandits. He didn't mention the testaments, the hidden fortune, because he didn't know about it. He just told him the truth as he knew it. "She's an orphan, Sheriff. I couldn't leave her." Sheriff Elias, a man of simple morals, looked at Sarah and then at Poe, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You did the right thing, Poe. The banker's family. They were good people. I'll send out a wire to the next town to see if anyone knows about this. We'll find her kin." For a brief moment, Poe felt a sense of relief. The law was involved. Maybe his part was over. But that hope was short-lived. The next day, the mocking escalated. A local drunk stumbled up to Poe, who was trying to get a pair of shoes for Sarah. "Look at that!" the drunk slurred. "A man who's seen more blood than a butcher, now playing dress-up with a little girl. You'll bore her to death with all your silence." Poe ignored him, but a sharp-eyed woman who was passing by, a woman he recognized as one of the town's most prominent gossips, looked at Sarah with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Poor little thing," she said, loud enough for Poe to hear. "She's probably seen things a child should never see. And now she's with him? What kind of life is that?" Poe took Sarah's hand and led her out of the store. He knew the whispers would be the least of his problems. The real danger was yet to come. The world outside the town, the world of greed and violence, was a far greater threat than the local gossip. And as he looked down at Sarah's small hand in his, he knew he was in this alone. The ridicule was just the beginning. The real battle was for her life and for his own redemption. The days in redemption passed under a cloud of scrutiny and open hostility. Poe, unaccustomed to the constant whispers and glares, felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on him. Sarah, who had started to talk in hesitant, whispered sentences, seemed oblivious to the contempt, but Poe knew she wasn't. She would flinch when someone spoke ill of him, and she would squeeze his hand tighter. One afternoon, as Poe was patching a leak in the boarding house roof, a wiry, nervous man named Barnaby, the town's telegraph operator, approached him. Barnaby was known for being a gossip and a know-it-all, but he looked genuinely rattled. "Poe," he said, his voice hushed. "I just got a wire from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. It's about a stagecoach robbery." Poe's heart thumped against his ribs. "What about it?" "The stagecoach that was hit. It belonged to a man named Arthur Sterling. He was a banker from Prescott." Barnaby paused, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "They say he was carrying a significant amount of money and a family heirloom. But the wire also said something else. A will. A secret one. They're looking for any survivors, especially a girl, his daughter." Poe's mind reeled. The satchel he'd found on the dead banker. He'd put it in a box in his room, not wanting to touch the man's personal belongings. He'd only noticed it because it was clutched so tightly in the banker's hand. He realized with a chilling certainty that the satchel must contain the will and possibly the key to the entire fortune. He felt a cold sweat run down his back. Sarah wasn't just an orphan. She was an heiress. The ridicule was one thing, but this would bring a different kind of danger. He thanked Barnaby and quickly went to his room. He found the satchel under his bed and opened it. Inside, there was a small stack of papers and a sealed envelope, all written in a spidery, elegant hand. The first document was a formal will, naming his wife and daughter as his sole beneficiaries. The second document was a separate sealed envelope addressed to "My dearest daughter, Sarah Sterling." Poe's hands trembled as he held it. He didn't have the right to open it, but he had to know what was inside. He carefully broke the seal. The letter was a heartbreaking farewell from a father to his daughter, filled with love and regret. But at the bottom, there was a small note. It was a secret, the banker explained. A way to protect his daughter from the men who would seek to steal her inheritance. He had hidden a significant portion of his fortune in a remote location, and he had created a series of clues, a treasure map of sorts, for her to follow. The first clue was a simple drawing, a small, ornate bird with a key in its beak. Poe felt a wave of dizziness. He wasn't just protecting a little girl anymore, he was protecting a fortune. He was a target, and so was she. The men who had attacked the stagecoach, they were not just common thieves. They were looking for something specific, and now they would be looking for him. The ridicule, the insults, they were nothing. The real predators were out there, and they would do anything to get their hands on that fortune. He quickly hid the documents in a small, waterproof bag and put it in a secret compartment in his saddle. He had to be careful. He couldn't trust anyone. Not the sheriff, not Mrs. Gable, not even Barnaby. The greed for money was a powerful force, and it turned good people into monsters. He went to the general store and bought a few things he'd need for a journey. The owner, Higgins, looked at him with an even colder sneer than before. "Going on a trip, Poe? Taking the little one with you?" "Something like that," Poe said, his voice flat. He paid for the supplies and left. He knew he couldn't stay in Redemption. The town was too small, the gossip too fast. He had to get Sarah away from here, to a place where he could figure out what to do. He found Sarah playing with a stray kitten behind the boarding house. She looked up at him, her face filled with a simple, childlike joy that was in stark contrast to the darkness he felt. "Poe," she said, her voice a small whisper, "can we go for a ride? I want to see the mountains." He knelt down and looked into her eyes. "We are going for a ride, Sarah, a long one, but it's important that you stay close to me, no matter what." She nodded, a serious expression on her face. "I will. I'm not afraid." He smiled, a rare and fleeting thing. He knew she was afraid, but he also knew she was brave. He packed their meager belongings and prepared the horses. He wasn't a bounty hunter anymore. He was a guardian, a protector, a man with a secret that could get them both killed. He didn't know where the journey would take them, but he knew he couldn't fail. He wouldn't let the past repeat itself. He would protect Sarah with his life. The news of the Sterling stagecoach robbery had not only reached Poe, but it had also reached the ears of the most powerful and ruthless man in the region, Orson Vance, a rival banker from the booming city of Prescott. Vance was a man of immense ambition and cold calculation. He had always coveted Sterling's financial empire and saw this tragedy as a unique opportunity to seize it. The rumor of a secret will and a surviving heiress set his sinister plans in motion. Vance was a man who preferred to operate from the shadows. He had an extensive network of informers and hired guns, men who did his dirty work without question. His most trusted enforcer was a man named Gideon Shaw, a former Pinkerton detective who had been disgraced and now worked for Vance, his moral compass completely corrupted by greed. Shaw was a formidable opponent, a man with a sharp mind and a talent for tracking. The telegraph from the Pinkerton agency had been deliberately vague, mentioning only a survivor, but Vance had other sources. He had paid off a corrupt marshal in a nearby town who had intercepted a private wire from Sheriff Elias in Redemption, detailing Poe's discovery of the girl. The name John Poe Carter was a red flag. Vance knew of Poe's reputation as a deadly gunslinger and a man who was hard to track. "Find them, Gideon," Vance commanded in his lavish office, the scent of expensive cigar smoke thick in the air. "I don't care what it takes. Get the girl, get the will, and make sure Carter doesn't get in your way. And if he does—" Gideon nodded, a cold glint in his eyes. He knew what his employer was implying. He had a personal score to settle with Poe. Their paths had crossed years ago, and Gideon had come out on the losing end. This wasn't just a job, it was a chance for revenge. Meanwhile, Poe and Sarah were a day's ride from Redemption, heading north towards the rough, unforgiving terrain of the Arizona Badlands. Poe knew this was a risky move, but he also knew it was their best option. The Badlands were a maze of canyons and rock formations, a natural fortress that would make them difficult to follow. He had to be one step ahead of anyone who was looking for them. Sarah, though still quiet, was beginning to open up. She asked him questions about the birds they saw, about the strange plants that grew in the desert. Poe, a man of few words, found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her stories about the stars, about the history of the land, about the old Indian legends. He was surprised by how much he enjoyed it. The little girl, who had been a source of anxiety, was becoming a source of light. They made camp under a rocky overhang. The stars were brilliant, a cold, hard diamond dust against the black sky. Sarah was asleep, her small body curled up in her blanket. Poe was on watch, his rifle resting against his knee. He felt a familiar sense of paranoia, a feeling he hadn't had since his days as a bounty hunter. He felt eyes on him, a hunter's instinct telling him he was being watched. He knew it wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It was a man. He decided to move camp before dawn. He woke Sarah and they packed up their things in the moonlight. They rode for hours, Poe's senses on high alert. He found a small, hidden cave, a perfect place to hide. They dismounted and settled in. He was tired, but the adrenaline kept him awake. He watched the sunrise, the sky bleeding from purple to orange. He saw them then, in the distance, a small group of riders, a thin trail of dust in their wake. They were professional. They didn't make a lot of noise. They were moving with a purpose. Poe knew they were looking for him. He saw the way they fanned out, searching for tracks. He knew one of them was Gideon. He recognized the way he moved, the way he commanded his men. Gideon was a man who never gave up. He pulled Sarah closer. "We have to be quiet now," he whispered. "No matter what you hear, do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide. She looked at the riders in the distance, and then back at him. She trusted him completely. Poe watched as the men came closer. He could hear their horses' hooves, the low rumble of their voices. He felt a wave of fear, not for himself, but for Sarah. He had made a promise to her, a silent vow to keep her safe. He would not break it. He would not let the past repeat itself. He would fight for her, for the chance to give her the life her father had wanted for her. He would fight for his own redemption. The hunter was now the hunted, and his only purpose was to protect the heiress. Poe knew he couldn't outrun Gideon and his men forever. They were relentless and well-equipped. He needed a plan, and he needed help. His first instinct was to handle things on his own, as he always had. But a small voice in his head, a voice that sounded a lot like Sarah, told him that this time he couldn't. He had a new responsibility, and he couldn't risk her life for the sake of his pride. He decided to head towards the small, isolated town of Haven Creek, a place known for being a hideout for men who wanted to disappear. It was a dangerous choice, but it was also a place where he could find a new ally. His old friend Silas "Slick" Calhoun ran the general store in Haven Creek. Silas was a former gambler and a man with a talent for finding things and people who didn't want to be found. He was a man with a checkered past and a heart of gold. Poe knew he could trust him. The journey was slow and difficult. They had to travel mostly at night to avoid Gideon's men. Sarah was a trooper. She didn't complain, and she understood the need for secrecy. Poe found himself admiring her resilience. She was a child who had seen the worst of humanity, but she still had a spark of hope in her eyes. They arrived in Haven Creek at dawn. The town was a collection of rough-hewn cabins and a saloon that looked like it had seen better days. Poe found Silas in his store, his head bent over a ledger. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise, when he saw Poe and the little girl. "Poe," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I thought you'd disappeared off the face of the earth. Who's your little friend?" Poe told him everything, the stagecoach, the bandits, the will, and Gideon. Silas listened, his expression growing more serious with each word. "Vance," Silas said, shaking his head. "That snake. I knew he was up to no good. But Gideon, that's a different kind of trouble. He's a bloodhound." Poe nodded. "I know. That's why I came to you. I need your help. I need to get Sarah to a safe place, somewhere Vance can't find her, and I need a way to outsmart Gideon." Silas didn't hesitate. "Of course, she's a good kid, Poe. I can see it in her eyes. We'll find a way. First, we need to make sure she's safe. There's a woman here, Marta. She's a retired nurse. She can look after her for a while." Silas led them to a small, comfortable cabin on the outskirts of town. Marta was a kind, elderly woman with a warm smile. She took one look at Sarah, and her heart melted. "Don't you worry, little one," she said. her voice like a soft blanket. "You're safe here. I'll take good care of you." Sarah looked at Poe, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. "You'll come back, won't you?" "I'll always come back," he said, his voice firm. He promised her 1,000 things in that single sentence. He promised her he would not leave her. He promised her he would fight for her. He left Sarah with Marta and went back to Silas's store. "What's the plan?" Poe asked. Silas laid out a map on his desk. "Gideon will be looking for you on the main roads. He'll assume you're heading to a big city, somewhere you can disappear. We'll do the opposite. We'll go deeper into the Badlands, to a place he'll never expect, a place only a few people know about, the Whispering Canyon." "Whispering Canyon," Poe repeated, a hint of a smile on his face. He knew the place. It was a maze of narrow passes and high cliffs, a natural labyrinth. "It's a perfect place to set a trap." Silas nodded. "We'll lead him right into it. We'll make him think you're still with the girl, but we'll leave a trail that leads him to a dead end. We'll split up. You'll go with me to the canyon, and my men will create a diversion. We'll lead them on a wild goose chase while you and Sarah escape." Poe liked the plan. It was risky, but it was their only chance. He looked at Silas, a sense of gratitude in his heart. "Thank you, Silas. I owe you." "You don't owe me a thing, Poe," Silas said, a genuine smile on his face. "This is for the girl. She deserves a chance." They began to prepare for the journey, gathering supplies and packing their horses. Poe felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer a lone wolf. He had an ally, a friend, and a reason to fight. He was a guardian, and he would not fail. The plan was set in motion. Poe and Silas, along with a small team of Silas's most trusted men, left Haven Creek before dawn, riding west towards the desolate landscape of the Whispering Canyon. The canyon was a place of wild beauty and unforgiving terrain, a maze of towering red cliffs, narrow ravines, and hidden caves. It was a perfect place for an ambush. They left a false trail behind them, a series of deliberate tracks meant to mimic a group of travelers with a child. The rest of Silas's men would lead Gideon's group on a diversionary chase, pulling them away from the real destination. The goal was to split Gideon's forces and lead them into a trap. Poe felt a familiar calm settle over him. He was back in his element. The hunter was once again a hunter, but this time he was not hunting for money. He was hunting to protect a life. He had the advantage of knowing the terrain, a knowledge he had acquired over years of tracking and hunting. Gideon and his men, following the false trail, were a day behind them. Gideon, a cunning and experienced tracker, was not easily fooled. He noticed the deliberate nature of the tracks, the way they seemed a little too perfect. He knew it was a ruse, a trick, but he also knew he had to follow it. He had a suspicion that Poe was trying to lead them into a trap, but he was confident in his abilities. He wasn't a man to back down from a fight. As they rode deeper into the canyon, the landscape became more treacherous. The towering cliffs seemed to whisper in the wind, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves and the wind whistling through the rocks. Poe and Silas found a perfect spot for the ambush, a narrow pass with high cliffs on either side. They dismounted and prepared their weapons. The plan was to create a rock slide, blocking the path and trapping Gideon's men. They would then use the element of surprise to take them down. They waited. The sun was high in the sky, and the heat was oppressive. Poe's mind drifted back to Sarah. He wondered if she was safe, if she was happy. He felt a fierce, protective love for her, a love that he hadn't felt since he lost his own family. She was not a burden. She was a gift. She had given him a reason to fight, a reason to live. He heard them before he saw them, the faint sound of horses' hooves, the low rumble of voices. Gideon's men were getting closer. He saw Gideon's silhouette on a ridge above them, a grim look on his face. Gideon knew they were there. He was just waiting for the right moment to strike. Poe gave Silas a nod. They moved into position, their rifles ready. The sound of the horses grew louder. Poe could see Gideon's men now, their faces grim and determined. "Now!" Poe yelled. They fired their rifles, not at the men, but at the cliffs above them. The shots were followed by a deafening roar as a cascade of rocks and dirt thundered down the canyon, blocking the path and trapping Gideon's men. The horses reared and the men were thrown from their saddles. Gideon, with a look of pure rage on his face, pulled out his revolver. He saw Poe and Silas and began to fire. The sound of the gunshots echoed through the canyon, a violent symphony. Poe and Silas, with the advantage of the high ground, returned fire. It was a short, intense gunfight. Poe, with his years of experience, was a force of nature. He moved with a speed and precision that left Gideon's men dazed and confused. In a matter of minutes, the fight was over. Gideon's men were either dead or wounded. Gideon, wounded but still alive, lay on the ground, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and hatred. Poe walked over to him, his rifle aimed at his chest. "Where's Vance?" he asked. Gideon just laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You think you've won, Carter. You've only just begun. Vance will find you. He'll find the girl. You can't run forever." Poe didn't answer. He knew Gideon was right. He had won the battle. But the war was far from over. He and Silas tied up the wounded men and left them for the law to find. They left a note for the sheriff, explaining what had happened. Then they rode away, leaving the canyon and the carnage behind them. Poe knew he had to be careful. He had a new enemy, a more powerful and dangerous one. He had to get Sarah to a safe place, somewhere Vance couldn't find her. He had to protect her. He had to finish this. With Gideon and his men neutralized, Poe and Silas rode back to Haven Creek. The journey was long and silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. Poe's mind was on Sarah. He had left her vulnerable, and he wouldn't feel truly safe until she was back with him. They arrived at Marta's cabin as the sun was setting. Poe dismounted, his legs shaky from exhaustion. He rushed to the cabin and pushed the door open. Sarah was sitting at the table, drawing a picture with a piece of charcoal. She looked up, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Poe!" she cried, rushing to hug him. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around her, a wave of relief washing over him. "I told you I'd come back," he whispered. He explained the situation to Marta, who was a witness to their reunion. "Gideon is no longer a threat," he said. "But Vance is. We have to leave. Now." Marta nodded, her face grim. She had heard rumors of Vance and his ruthlessness. "You're right," she said. "We'll get you a wagon and some supplies. You can leave tonight." Silas agreed. "We'll make a plan. You can't stay here." That night, as they prepared to leave, something happened that changed everything. The town's newspaper, a small weekly publication, arrived on the stagecoach from Prescott. The front page was a shocking headline: "Banker's fortune missing, heiress sought." The article, a detailed account of the Sterling family's tragedy, mentioned the secret will and the missing heiress. It also mentioned the bounty, a staggering sum of money for anyone who could bring Sarah Sterling to the authorities. The article also contained a sketch of Sarah, a detailed portrait from her school photograph. The article had been commissioned and published by Orson Vance, a cunning move to expose the girl and force her captor into the open. Poe's blood ran cold. The bounty was a double-edged sword. It would bring every bounty hunter and greedy criminal in the region looking for them. But it also unveiled a truth that would change the town's perception of Poe. The next morning, as Poe, Sarah, and Silas were preparing to leave, a crowd had gathered outside the cabin. The whispers were no longer of mockery and scorn. They were of shock and awe. "She's the heiress," someone said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. "The banker's daughter." The townspeople, who had mocked Poe for taking in an orphan, now looked at him with a different kind of respect. They had thought he was a fool, a man burdened by a useless child. Now they saw him as a hero, a man who had risked his life to save an heiress. The ridicule was gone, replaced by a strange mix of admiration and curiosity. Poe felt a wave of disgust. Their change of heart was not born of genuine kindness, but of greed and a sudden, misplaced sense of admiration for money and power. He didn't care about their approval. He only cared about Sarah. The sheriff, Elias, who had been informed of the new developments, came to the cabin. He looked at Poe and Sarah, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. "Poe," he said, "I had no idea. This changes everything. We need to get her to Prescott, to the authorities. They'll protect her." Poe shook his head. "No, I'm not giving her to Vance. He's the one behind all of this. He's the one who wants her dead." Sheriff Elias looked at him, his expression serious. "Poe, Vance is a powerful man. He'll have the law on his side. You can't fight him alone." "I'm not alone," Poe said, looking at Silas, who stood by his side, his hand on his revolver. The sheriff looked at the two of them, a silent understanding passing between them. He knew Poe was right. He knew Vance was a dangerous man. He also knew that Poe, despite his reputation, was a good man. "Be careful, Poe," the sheriff said. "The bounty will bring every snake out of the woodwork. You're no longer just protecting a girl. You're protecting a fortune." Poe nodded. He and Silas mounted their horses. Sarah, now fully aware of the danger she was in, held onto Poe's coat, her small body trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. She was no longer just an orphan. She was an heiress, and her life was now a high-stakes game of survival. The bounty, published for all to see, had a predictable effect. The dusty roads of the Arizona frontier were suddenly teeming with new faces, bounty hunters, drifters, and desperate men, their eyes alight with the prospect of a fortune. All began their hunt. The easy prey was no longer a lone cowboy and an orphan. It was now a formidable gunslinger and a little girl with a price on her head. Poe, now fully aware of the scale of the threat, decided to change his strategy. He could no longer hide. He had to fight. He had to turn the tables on his pursuers. The hunted would become the hunter. Their first stop was a small, isolated canyon known as Serpent's Rest, a place Poe knew from his days as a bounty hunter. It was a natural ambush point, a narrow gorge that forced anyone who entered to ride in a single file. Poe and Silas would wait for their first pursuers there, and they would make an example of them. Poe and Silas prepared their weapons, sharpening their knives and cleaning their rifles. Sarah, who had grown surprisingly calm in the face of danger, helped them, her small hands wiping down the barrels of the guns. "Are we going to fight them, Poe?" she asked, her voice a small whisper. "We are," he said, his voice firm. "But we're not going to hurt anyone who doesn't try to hurt us first. We're just going to make sure they know we're not an easy target." She nodded, a serious expression on her face. She was a child, but she was a child of the frontier. She understood the language of violence and survival. Their first pursuers were a trio of young, cocky men, all of them looking for an easy payday. They rode into Serpent's Rest, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their voices loud and confident. Poe and Silas waited for them. The moment they entered the gorge, they triggered a small rock slide, blocking their path. The men, startled, drew their weapons, their faces contorted in a mixture of confusion and fear. Poe stepped out from behind a rock, his rifle aimed at the leader. "Drop your weapons," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Now." The men, seeing the look in his eyes, didn't hesitate. They knew a man who meant business when they saw one. They dropped their rifles, and Poe and Silas disarmed them. They then tied them up and left them for the law to find. Poe didn't want to kill them. He wanted to send a message. The message spread like wildfire. The town's telegraph office was abuzz with the news. "Poe Carter is not a soft target. He's a dangerous man, and he's not afraid to fight." Vance, who had been waiting for news of the girl's capture, was furious. He had underestimated Poe. He had thought he was a fool, a man who would be easily outmaneuvered. He was wrong. He knew he had to take a different approach. He had to send his best men. He sent a private wire to a notorious group of mercenaries, a group known for their ruthlessness and their ability to get the job done. The group, known as the Vultures, was a terrifying force. Poe and Silas knew they were no match for a large, well-organized group of mercenaries. They had to be smart. They had to use their knowledge of the land, their wits, and their courage. They rode deeper into the wilderness, their destination a remote, hidden canyon known as the Sanctuary. It was a place known only to a few, a place so remote and so well hidden that no one would ever think to look for them there. It was a place where they could rest and regroup, and where they could plan their next move. They arrived at the sanctuary as the sun was setting. The canyon was a beautiful, peaceful place, a place of quiet solitude. Poe felt a sense of calm he hadn't felt since he had found Sarah. He knew he was in a dangerous situation, but he also knew he was with the right people. He was with his friend, and he was with the little girl who had given him a new purpose in life. He was a guardian, a protector, and he would not fail. The sanctuary was a place of quiet contemplation and hard work. Poe and Silas spent their days fortifying their position, creating a small, defensible camp. Sarah, now more confident and at ease, became an integral part of their small family. She was no longer a silent, fearful child. She was a curious, brave little girl who had found a new life and a new purpose. Poe, a man who had spent his life fighting and surviving, found himself in a new role, a mentor. He taught Sarah how to use a compass, how to read a map, and how to identify different plants and animals. He taught her how to survive in the wilderness, teaching her a set of skills that would not only keep her safe, but would also give her a sense of empowerment. He was no longer just a protector, he was a guide. Sarah, in turn, taught Poe something he had long forgotten: how to live. She would ask him questions about his past, about his life. He found himself opening up to her, telling her stories about his family, about the life he had lost. He told her about his wife, Clara, and his son, David, and the pain of losing them. He spoke of the guilt he felt, the guilt that had been a part of him for so long. "Why do you feel guilty?" she asked one night, her small voice a beacon in the darkness. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I should have been there," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I should have protected them." "You couldn't have known," she said, her small hand reaching out and touching his. "My daddy told me. He said we can't control everything, we just have to do our best." "You did your best, Poe." Her words were a balm to his soul. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of forgiveness, not from God, but from a little girl who had found a way to see his heart. He felt a release, a letting go of a burden he had carried for too long. He realized that Sarah was not just a symbol of his redemption, she was the source of it. Silas, a man who had known Poe for years, watched their relationship with a sense of wonder. He saw the change in his friend, the way the hard edges of his soul had begun to soften. He knew that this little girl had given Poe something he had lost a long time ago: his humanity. One afternoon, as they were sitting by the fire, Sarah took out the compass Poe had given her. She looked at it, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "What's wrong, Sarah?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "My daddy told me this compass would always point north, but it doesn't." Poe took the compass and looked at it. It was a beautiful, antique compass, but it was not pointing north. It was pointing in a different direction, towards the west. He looked at it, his mind racing. He remembered the first clue in the will, a small, ornate bird with a key in its beak. He also remembered the other clues, the small drawings that were scattered throughout the will. He looked at Sarah, a sudden realization dawning on him. The compass wasn't broken. It was a clue. The compass was pointing to the hidden fortune. The banker had hidden the fortune in a place that could only be found by following a series of clues. The compass, a seemingly useless object, was the key. Poe felt a wave of excitement and a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just protecting a little girl. He was helping her find her legacy. He was helping her fulfill her father's last wish. He and Silas looked at the compass, their minds racing with the possibilities. They knew that the compass was their only hope. It was their path to a new life, a new beginning. They knew they had to be careful. The vultures, Vance, and every other greedy criminal would be looking for them. But they also knew that they were not alone. They had each other. They had a reason to fight. They had a purpose. They were a family, and they were going to do everything in their power to make sure that Sarah got what was rightfully hers. The vultures were a force of nature, a storm of violence and greed. Their leader, a scarred man with a cold, calculating mind named Cain, had a reputation that preceded him. He was not a man of honor or loyalty, but a man of business. He and his crew were the best at what they did, hunting and killing. Orson Vance, desperate and furious, had given them a simple task: find the girl, get the will, and eliminate Poe Carter. Cain and his men were on a direct path, using their superior tracking skills to follow Poe's trail. They were not deterred by the false trails or the empty traps. They were professionals, and they knew how to get their man. Poe, Silas, and Sarah were on the move again, following the mysterious compass. The compass, a silent guide, led them westward, through treacherous mountain passes and across dry riverbeds. Poe felt the pressure mounting. He knew the vultures were close. He felt their presence, a cold chill that ran down his spine. They found a temporary sanctuary in a small, abandoned mining town. The town was a ghost of its former self, a collection of rotting wooden buildings and a saloon with a broken door. It was a perfect place to hide, a place where they could rest and prepare for the coming fight. Poe and Silas spent their days fortifying the town, creating a series of traps and ambushes. They set up tripwires, dug trenches, and created a network of tunnels and hiding spots. Sarah, with her newfound bravery, helped them, her small hands pulling up weeds and moving rocks. She was a silent, determined little soldier, and Poe was more proud of her than words could say. One night, as Poe was on watch, he saw them. A small group of riders, a thin line of dust on the horizon. The vultures. Poe's heart hammered against his ribs. The time had come. He woke Silas, and they prepared for the fight. They woke Sarah and explained the situation. "We have to be brave now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We have to fight for what's right." She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I'm with you." The vultures arrived at dawn. They were a menacing sight, a group of hard-faced men with rifles and revolvers. Cain, their leader, a man with a cold, unforgiving face, dismounted and surveyed the town. He knew it was a trap, but he didn't care. He was confident in his abilities, in his men. "Poe Carter!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the silent town. "Come out! We know you're in there!" Poe didn't answer. He was hidden, his rifle aimed at Cain. He waited for the right moment. Cain's men spread out, their rifles aimed at the buildings. They were a well-oiled machine, a group of killers who knew how to get the job done. Poe fired. The shot was a sharp crack that shattered the silence. One of the vultures fell, a gaping hole in his chest. The gunfight was a blur of motion and noise. Poe and Silas, with the advantage of the high ground and their knowledge of the terrain, were a formidable force. They moved with a lethal efficiency, a dance of death honed by years of practice. Cain, enraged, began to fire, his shots precise and deadly. He was a professional, and he was not to be underestimated. The fight raged on for what seemed like an eternity. Poe and Silas, despite their best efforts, were outnumbered. They were running out of ammunition, and the vultures were getting closer. Poe, with a desperate look in his eyes, looked at Sarah. "Go," he said. "Run, go to the mines. I'll hold them off." "No!" she cried. "I'm not leaving you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and despair. "I promise I'll find you. Just go." She hesitated for a moment, and then, with a look of pure determination, she ran. She ran towards the mines, her small body disappearing into the darkness. Poe, with a renewed sense of purpose, began to fight with a fury he hadn't felt in years. He was not just fighting for his life, he was fighting for hers. He was a guardian, a protector, and he would not fail. The battle for the mining town was a desperate one. Poe and Silas fought with everything they had, but the vultures were too numerous, too well armed. Poe, with a grim determination, knew he had to get Sarah out of there. He found a small hidden passage behind the saloon, a tunnel that led to the back of the town. He told Silas to create a diversion and to buy him some time. Silas, a man of unwavering loyalty, nodded. "I'll see you on the other side, Poe. Don't worry about me, just get that little girl to safety." Poe, with a heavy heart, left his friend to face a certain death. He ran to the mines, his heart pounding against his ribs. He found Sarah hiding behind a rock, her face streaked with tears. "Come on," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We have to go." He led her through the tunnels, the sound of gunshots echoing behind them. The tunnels were dark and damp, and Poe had to use a small lamp to light their way. They walked for what seemed like an eternity, their bodies weary and their minds exhausted. When they finally emerged from the tunnels, they were a few miles away from the town. Poe looked back at the town, a cloud of smoke rising from the buildings. He felt a wave of despair. He had lost his friend. He had failed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I couldn't save him." Sarah, with a wisdom beyond her years, wrapped her arms around him. "He did it for us," she said. "He was a good man, Poe." Her words were a comfort, a small beacon of hope in the darkness. He knew she was right. Silas had sacrificed himself for them, and he would not let his sacrifice be in vain. Poe and Sarah rode for days, their destination a small, isolated cabin in the mountains, a place he had used as a hideout during his bounty hunting days. It was a place no one knew about, a place where they could be safe, but they were not safe. Cain, the vulture leader, was a cunning and intelligent man. He had not only found a map of the tunnels, but he had also left a man to track their movements. He knew Poe was leading them to a secret location, and he was determined to find it. Poe, with his hunter's instinct, felt their presence. He saw a man on a horse, a thin line of dust on the horizon. He knew they were being followed. He looked at Sarah, a wave of fear washing over him. He was a man who had faced death 100 times, but he had never been more terrified than he was at that moment. He was not afraid for himself, but for her. He made a decision that would change everything. He would confront Vance directly. He would go to Prescott, to the lion's den. He would make him a deal. He would give him the will, the compass, everything in exchange for Sarah's safety. It was a risky move, a move that could get them both killed. But he had no other choice. He couldn't keep running. He had to face his enemy, and he had to do it on his own terms. As they rode towards Prescott, the sun setting behind them, Poe felt a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He was no longer just a protector. He was a negotiator. He was a man who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, but he was not the only one with a plan. Cain, who had been following them, saw his opportunity. He sent a private wire to Vance, informing him of Poe's location. He didn't want the bounty, he wanted the glory. He wanted to be the one to kill Poe Carter. Poe and Sarah rode into Prescott, a bustling city of brick and stone, a world away from the dusty frontier. The city was a place of wealth and power, a place where men like Poe were out of place. He felt a sense of unease, a feeling that something was about to go wrong. He went to Vance's office, a grand, intimidating building in the heart of the city. He left Sarah with a kind, elderly woman who owned a small bookstore, a woman who had a kind heart and a love for children. Poe walked into Vance's office, his hand on his revolver. Vance looked up, a triumphant look on his face. He was not surprised to see him. He had been waiting. "Poe Carter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I knew you'd come. Where's the girl? Where's the will?" "She's safe," Poe said, his voice flat. "And the will, it's in a safe place. I'll give it to you, everything, in exchange for one thing. You leave her alone. Forever." Vance laughed, a hollow sound. "You think you're in a position to negotiate, Carter? "You're a fool, you're alone, you're outnumbered. I have the law on my side and I have my men. You have nothing." Poe looked at him, a cold glint in his eyes. "I have something you don't," he said. "I have the truth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was a journal, a diary that the banker had kept. It was a record of Vance's illegal dealings, his shady business practices, his plan to steal the fortune. It was a weapon, a bomb, waiting to explode. Vance's face went pale. He knew the journal. He had been looking for it. He knew it was the one thing that could destroy him. "You're a fool, Carter," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You've just signed your own death warrant." He reached for a hidden button, and the door to his office opened. Two of his men, armed with rifles, walked in. Poe was trapped. He had walked into a trap, a betrayal he had not seen coming. He had underestimated his enemy, and he was about to pay the price. Poe was trapped, his back against the wall. The two men, Vance's enforcers, had their rifles aimed at his chest. Vance, with a triumphant smirk on his face, walked towards him. "Give me the journal, Carter, or you'll be a dead man." Poe, with a sudden, desperate move, threw the journal on the floor. "It's a fake," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The real one is with the girl, and if you touch her, the whole world will know what you've done." Vance's face went from triumph to fury. He knew Poe was bluffing, but he couldn't take the risk. He had to be sure. He had to get the girl. "Get him," he commanded his men. "Don't kill him. I want to know where she is." The two men moved towards Poe, their faces grim and determined. Poe, with a sudden, unexpected move, pulled out his revolver and fired. The shot was a sharp crack that echoed through the office. One of the men fell, a gaping hole in his chest. The other man fired, and a shot hit Poe in the shoulder. The pain was a sharp, blinding fire. He fell to his knees, his face contorted in pain. Vance, seeing his opportunity, grabbed the journal and looked at it. It was a fake. The pages were blank. He cursed under his breath. He had been outsmarted. He looked at Poe, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. He pulled out his own revolver and aimed it at Poe's head. "You're a fool, Carter," he said. "You've lost." Just as he was about to fire, the door to the office burst open. A group of lawmen, led by Sheriff Heiress, stormed in. The sheriff had received a private wire from Silas, who had sent it just before his final stand. The wire had contained all the information about Vance's scheme, his plan to steal the fortune, and his plan to kill Poe. Sheriff Heiress looked at Vance, his face a grim mask. "Orson Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're under arrest." Vance, with a look of pure shock on his face, dropped his revolver. He was a man of power, a man who had controlled the city, but he was no match for the law. Poe, wounded but alive, watched as Vance was led away in handcuffs. He had won. He had survived, but he had paid a heavy price. He had lost his friend, and he had been wounded. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He was taken to the town's hospital, where a doctor looked at his wound. The wound was serious, but it was not life-threatening. He would live. He lay in the hospital bed, his mind racing. He had won the battle. But the war was not over. He knew that the vultures were still out there, and he knew that they would be looking for Sarah. He knew he had to get to her. He had to protect her. He got out of bed, his body weak and his mind weary. He had to find her. He had to make sure she was safe. He found her at the bookstore, sitting on a chair, reading a book. She looked up, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Poe!" she cried, rushing to hug him. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around her, a wave of relief washing over him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have come sooner." She shook her head. "You came," she said. "That's all that matters." He looked at her, a wave of love washing over him. He had lost so much, but he had also gained so much. He had a new family, a new purpose. He was a hero, a man who had risked everything for a little girl. The aftermath of Vance's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. The news of the banker's secret will and the missing heiress spread like wildfire. The city's newspapers were filled with stories of Poe's bravery and Vance's greed. Poe, a man who had spent his life in the shadows, was now a hero. Poe and Sarah were taken to the city's finest hotel, where they were given a suite of rooms. They were no longer fugitives. They were guests. Poe was no longer a bounty hunter. He was a guardian, a protector, a man who had risked everything for a little girl. Sarah, now in a safe and secure environment, began to flourish. She was no longer a silent, fearful child. She was a curious, brave little girl who had found a new life and a new purpose. She was no longer an orphan. She was an heiress. Poe, with the help of the sheriff, began to piece together the clues in the will. The compass, the journal, the other clues. They all pointed to a single location. The hidden fortune was not money, it was a treasure, a collection of priceless artifacts and documents that would make Sarah a wealthy and powerful woman. The fortune was not in a bank vault, but in a hidden cavern in the mountains, a place the banker had used to store his most valuable possessions. The compass was the key, the guide that would lead them to the treasure. Poe and Sarah, with the help of the sheriff, began to prepare for the journey. They were no longer running from anyone. They were on a quest to find the fortune that would change their lives forever. They rode back into the wilderness, their destination, the hidden cavern. The journey was long and difficult, but they were no longer alone. The sheriff and a small group of lawmen rode with them, their mission to protect the heiress and the guardian. They arrived at the cavern, a hidden place in the mountains, a place that no one had ever found. The cavern was a treasure trove, a collection of priceless artifacts, gold and documents that would make Sarah a wealthy woman. Poe looked at Sarah, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. She was no longer a little girl who had lost everything. She was an heiress, a powerful woman who had found a new life and a new purpose. The journey had not been easy. They had faced danger, loss, and betrayal, but they had also found something priceless. A family. Poe was no longer a lone wolf. He was a father. Sarah was no longer an orphan. She was a daughter. They were a family, and they were going to do everything in their power to make sure that their new life was a happy one. The discovery of the fortune was a life-altering event for both Poe and Sarah. The artifacts and gold, now secured, were just a part of the true treasure. The real inheritance was the legacy of her father's integrity and foresight. With the money, Sarah could live a life of comfort and security, but more importantly, she had Poe, a man who had become her father in every sense of the word. They returned to Prescott, their journey a triumph. The city, which had once mocked Poe, now celebrated him. He was a hero, a man who had risked his life to protect a little girl. The town of Redemption, upon hearing the news, sent a letter of apology, a gesture that Poe accepted with a quiet dignity. Poe, however, was not content with the fanfare. He had one last piece of business to take care of. He had to confront the ghosts of his past. He had to find the man who had killed his family. He knew the man's name, and he knew where he was. The man, a notorious bandit named Silas the Snake Calhoun, was a fugitive, a man who had been on the run for years. Poe had heard rumors that he was hiding in a remote canyon, a place known as the Serpent's Coil. Poe, with a heavy heart, decided to leave Sarah with a trusted friend and go on one last journey. He had to finish what he had started. He had to find the man who had destroyed his life and face him. He rode for days, his mind a blur of memories and emotions. He remembered his wife Clara, her beautiful smile, and his son David, his curious eyes. He remembered the night they were taken from him, the night his life had changed forever. He arrived at the Serpent's Coil, a place of sheer cliffs and dark shadows. He found the man, a wizened old man with a face as hard as stone. The man, with a look of recognition in his eyes, looked at him. "Poe Carter," he said, his voice a low, guttural sound. "I knew you'd come. I've been waiting for you." Poe didn't answer. He just looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and despair. "I didn't mean to kill them," the man said, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I just wanted to scare you. I didn't know they were there." Poe didn't believe him. He had seen the way the man had laughed, the way he had taken their lives without a second thought. He was a killer, a man who had no soul. Poe pulled out his revolver and aimed it at the man. He had waited for this moment for years, for the chance to avenge his family. He had a chance to get his revenge. But as he looked at the man, a wave of doubt washed over him. He was no longer the man he had been. He was a father, a guardian, a man who had found a new purpose in life. He was not a killer, he was a protector. He lowered his revolver, a look of pure sorrow on his face. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't kill you. I'm not that man anymore." The man, with a look of surprise on his face, looked at him. He had expected to die, but he had been given a second chance. "Get out of here," Poe said, his voice a low rumble. "And don't ever come back. If I ever see you again, I'll kill you." The man, with a look of gratitude in his eyes, turned and ran. He was a ghost, a man who had been given a new life. Poe stood there, his mind a blur of emotions. He had not gotten his revenge, but he had found something more valuable, his humanity. He had let go of his past, and he was ready to embrace his future. He was a man who had been reborn, a man who had found a new purpose in life. The journey back to Prescott was a long one, but Poe felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He had finally let go of the ghosts of his past, and he was ready to embrace his future. He was a man who had been reborn, a man who had found a new purpose in life. He arrived at the hotel, and Sarah rushed to hug him. "Poe!" she cried, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and love. "I missed you." He knelt down and wrapped his arms around her, a wave of love washing over him. "I missed you too," he whispered. "I'm not going to leave you again." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and admiration. "I know," she said. "You're my daddy." Her words were a balm to his soul. He had not gotten his revenge, but he had found something more valuable, a family. He was no longer a lone wolf, he was a father. Sarah was no longer an orphan, she was a daughter. They were a family, and they were going to live their lives together. The years passed, and Poe and Sarah's story became a legend. Poe, a man who had once been a ruthless bounty hunter, was now a respected and beloved figure in the community. He was a man who had found redemption, a man who had found a new purpose in life. Sarah grew into a beautiful, intelligent, and compassionate young woman. She used her fortune to help the less fortunate, building orphanages and schools, and helping those who had been left behind. She was a woman who had been given a second chance, and she was determined to make the most of it. Poe, with a heart filled with love and pride, watched her grow. He had lost so much, but he had also gained so much. He had a family, a home, and a purpose. He was a man who had found redemption, a man who had found a new life. One evening, as the sun was setting, Poe and Sarah were sitting on a porch watching the golden sunset. The sky was a canvas of red, orange, and purple, a beautiful farewell to the day. "Poe," she said, her voice a soft whisper, "what would you have done if you hadn't found me?" He looked at her, a gentle smile on his face. "I would have been a lost soul," he said. "I would have been a man with no purpose, a man with no heart. You saved me, Sarah. You gave me a reason to live." She looked at him, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "You saved me too, Poe," she said. "You gave me a new life, a new family. You gave me a home." He wrapped his arm around her, and they sat in silence, watching the sunset. They were a family, a man and a little girl who had found each other in the most unexpected of places. They were a testament to the power of love, the power of redemption, and the power of a single act of kindness. The golden sunset was a fitting end to their story, a symbol of a new beginning.